It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, and the house felt unusually calm. I had just returned from a rare shopping spree, something I rarely allowed myself to indulge in. Among the bags and boxes, one item stood out. A sleek, elegant dress that caught my eye the moment I saw it. It was nothing like my usual wardrobe. Maybe it was the color or the way it shimmered under the store lights, but I felt an urge to treat myself for once. Upstairs in my bedroom, I slipped the dress on, the fabric hugging me perfectly. I couldn't help but smile as I glanced at the mirror. It felt good, different, but good. I turned this way and that, admiring how it moved, trying to decide if it was really me. Just then, the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. I froze, mid-turn. The door wasn't fully closed, but I didn't think much of it earlier. Before I could move, it creaked open slightly, and there he was, Jason, my stepson, standing in the doorway. He looked as startled as I felt, his eyes widening in confusion. "Oh, sorry," he stammered, quickly averting his gaze. "I didn't mean to." In that split second, a million thoughts raced through my mind. Why didn't I lock the door? What was he even doing upstairs? And most of all, how could I possibly explain the awkwardness of this moment without making it worse? Jason turned to leave, mumbling something under his breath, but I stopped him. "Wait, Jason," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. "It's okay. What did you need?" He hesitated, still looking anywhere but directly at me. I, I was just looking for my headphones," he finally said. "I thought they might be in here." My heart was racing, but I nodded. "They're probably downstairs in the living room," I said, hoping to ease the tension. As he walked away, closing the door behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The moment felt strange, unspoken, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the start of something bigger. After Jason left, I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It wasn't like him to come upstairs unannounced, and something about the way he hurried off felt off. Shaking my head, I told myself I was overthinking it. It was just a fleeting moment, nothing more. Still, I couldn't shake the strange tension lingering in the room. As I changed back into my usual clothes, my thoughts drifted to how much things had changed since I married Jason's dad, Mark. Blending families was never easy, and while Jason and I had always been polite to each other, we hadn't really bonded. He was 16, quiet, and mostly kept to himself, glued to his headphones or phone. I tried to give him space, knowing how hard it must be for him to adjust to a stepmom in the house. Mark had been working longer hours lately, which meant Jason and I often had the house to ourselves in the evenings. It wasn't awkward exactly, but the silence between us always felt heavy, like neither of us knew what to say. I wondered if moments like this, accidental, uncomfortable, and full of misunderstandings, were part of the reason we hadn't grown closer. Later that evening, I found Jason in the living room, his headphones perched around his neck, scrolling through his phone. I debated whether to bring up the earlier incident, but I didn't want to make things weird. Instead, I sat down across from him and tried to break the ice. "Find your headphones?" I asked lightly. He nodded without looking up. "Yeah, they were under the couch." "Glad you found them," I said, unsure what else to add. The silence stretched between us, and I couldn't tell if he was avoiding eye contact or just lost in whatever he was watching. I decided to leave it alone for now. Jason had always been reserved, and I didn't want to push him. But as I headed to the kitchen to start dinner, I caught a glimpse of his expression, something between confusion and guilt, like he was wrestling with something unspoken. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't stop wondering if there was more to his behavior than I realized. Maybe it wasn't just the dress or the moment earlier. Something felt unsettled, and I couldn't help but feel like I was missing a piece of a much larger puzzle. The next day, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. Jason's behavior seemed normal on the surface, but there was something subtle that felt different. He was quieter than usual at breakfast, picking at his cereal while keeping his eyes glued to the table. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just tired or had a lot on his mind. Teenagers could be moody. It wasn't anything new. But as the hours passed, small things began to stand out. Jason seemed to avoid being in the same room as me, disappearing into his bedroom or heading outside whenever I entered. When I asked him if everything was okay, he nodded quickly and gave a vague, "Yeah, I'm fine." Still, I could tell something was bothering him. In the afternoon, I decided to tidy up the living room. As I straightened the cushions on the couch, I found one of Jason's notebooks wedged between them. It was closed, the cover plain and unassuming, but for a moment I hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave it untouched, respecting his privacy, but the other part of me, curious and concerned, couldn't help but wonder if it held some clue about what was going on with him. I told myself I'd only look at the first page, just a quick glance to see if it was something important. But when I opened it, I realized it wasn't filled with notes or schoolwork. Instead, it was packed with drawings, sketches of people, places, and scenes that seemed to tell some sort of story. One drawing caught my eye immediately. It was of a woman standing in front of a mirror, her expression uncertain. The details were strikingly familiar: the long hair, the way she held her hands nervously. It didn't take long to realize it was me. My stomach tightened as I flipped through the pages. There were more sketches, some of me, some of other people I didn't recognize, but they all seemed connected somehow. It was as if Jason was using his art to process something he couldn't put into words. When I heard footsteps coming down the stairs, I quickly closed the notebook and placed it back where I'd found it. My heart raced as Jason walked into the room, his eyes flicking briefly to the couch before he looked at me. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice steady but guarded. "Just cleaning up," I replied, trying to sound casual. But inside, I couldn't ignore the growing sense that Jason was keeping a secret, and it was only a matter of time before it came to light. Jason's reaction to finding me in the living room felt like a quiet storm. He didn't say much, but the way his eyes lingered on the couch where his notebook had been told me he knew. The air between us felt heavy, but I wasn't sure if it was guilt on my end or something else entirely. He left the room quickly, muttering something about going upstairs, and I didn't stop him. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't focus on anything. The sketches in his notebook played over and over in my mind. Why would he draw me like that? Was it a sign of something deeper, or was it just harmless creativity? My instincts told me there was more to it than I wanted to admit. Later that night, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard a sound from upstairs, a muffled thud, followed by hurried footsteps. I paused, my hands still in the soapy water, and listened. Jason's door creaked open, and I heard him moving around, his movements rushed and deliberate. "Jason?" I called out, but there was no response. I dried my hands and made my way up the stairs. His door was ajar, and I could see him sitting on the floor, his back to me, surrounded by scattered papers and sketches. He didn't notice me at first, so I knocked gently. He flinched and turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see the tension on his face. "Everything okay?" I asked softly. "Yeah," he replied quickly, shuffling some of the papers into a pile. "I was just organizing." I could tell he was trying to hide something, but I didn't want to push too hard. Instead, I leaned against the door frame and said, "You're really talented, you know. I saw some of your drawings earlier. They're incredible." His eyes darted to me, narrowing slightly. "You looked at my stuff?" There it was, the tension bubbling to the surface. I held up my hands defensively. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy. I was cleaning and found the notebook. I only saw a little. He let out a frustrated sigh, standing up abruptly. You don't get it, he said, his voice rising slightly. You're not supposed to see that. Jason, I said, my voice calm but firm. If something's bothering you, you can talk to me. But he shook his head, stepping back. You wouldn't understand, he muttered, before grabbing the stack of papers and walking past me, heading straight out of the room. I stood there, staring at the empty doorway, my heart racing. Whatever he was hiding, it felt bigger than I had imagined, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all about to unravel. As Jason disappeared down the hallway, his words echoed in my mind. You wouldn't understand. It wasn't just frustration in his voice. It was something deeper, like he was carrying a burden he didn't know how to share. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to follow him or give him space. Eventually, I decided to leave him alone, hoping he'd open up when he was ready. The next morning, I woke up early, still uneasy about the night before. Jason was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal. His headphones were on, but he wasn't listening to anything, just staring blankly at the tabletop. I hesitated, then walked over and poured myself a cup of coffee. Morning, I said, trying to sound casual. Morning, he replied without looking up. I sat down across from him, searching for the right words. Listen, about last night, I started, but he cut me off. It's fine, he said quickly, his tone flat. I shouldn't have yelled. It's not about that, I said gently. I just want to make sure you're okay. Whatever it is, you don't have to handle it alone. For a moment, I thought he might open up. He glanced at me, his expression softening, but then he shook his head. I'm fine, he mumbled, grabbing his bowl and heading for the sink. As the day went on, I couldn't stop replaying the events in my mind. Jason's behavior was so unlike him, and the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that something bigger was going on. I decided to do something I hadn't done before, call Mark. Mark picked up on the second ring, his voice warm but distracted. Hey, everything okay? I hesitated. I think so, I said. But I'm worried about Jason. Have you noticed anything off with him lately? Mark sighed. He's a teenager. They go through phases. But now that you mention it, he's been more withdrawn than usual. Do you think something's wrong? I pressed. There was a pause. Maybe. I don't know. He hasn't said anything to me, but I'll try to talk to him tonight. After we hung up, I felt a little better, but not entirely. Something told me this wasn't just a typical teenage phase. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, Jason's backpack caught my eye. It was sitting by the front door, partially unzipped. I tried to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I glanced around to make sure he wasn't nearby, then knelt down and carefully opened it. Inside, I found more sketches, similar to the ones in his notebook, but darker. These weren't just drawings of people or everyday scenes. They depicted something chaotic, almost haunting. One image showed a house engulfed in shadows, with a figure standing in the doorway. Another showed a woman crying, her face obscured. As I flipped through the pages, a folded piece of paper slipped out and fell to the floor. I picked it up and unfolded it, revealing what looked like a letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but as I read the first few lines, my stomach dropped. I'm sorry for everything. I didn't mean for it to get this far. The rest of the letter was cut off, as though Jason had crumpled it before finishing. My hands trembled as I folded it back up and returned it to the bag. Whatever was going on, it was much more serious than I had thought. Just then, I heard the front door creak open. Jason was back, and I could feel my pulse quicken as I tried to act normal. This wasn't just about helping him anymore. It was about figuring out the truth before it was too late. Jason walked in, his eyes flicking briefly to his backpack near the door. I tried to stay calm, busying myself at the counter, but I could feel the weight of his gaze. He didn't say anything, just stood there, like he was waiting for something. "Dinner will be ready soon," I said, keeping my tone light. "Okay," he muttered, moving toward his bag. My heart pounded as he picked it up and glanced at me, his expression guarded. "Did you—" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Never mind." I wanted to say something, to let him know I'd seen the letter and the sketches, but I wasn't sure how. Instead, I watched as he turned and headed up to his room, leaving the tension hanging in the air. Later that night, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I knocked on his door, and when he didn't answer, I pushed it open slightly. Jason was sitting on the edge of his bed, his backpack open beside him. His face was pale, and his hands were clutching the crumpled letter I'd found earlier. "Jason," I said softly, stepping inside, "we need to talk." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I nodded. I saw some of the sketches and the letter. "Jason, whatever's going on, I'm here for you. But I need you to tell me the truth." For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, with a deep breath, he began to explain. The sketches, he said, were his way of dealing with feelings he didn't know how to express. Confusion, frustration, even guilt. The letter wasn't what I feared. It wasn't a goodbye. It was something he'd written in a moment of overwhelming emotion, a way to get the thoughts out of his head and onto paper. "But why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Because I thought you'd think I was weird," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't want to scare you." Tears filled my eyes as I sat beside him. "Jason, you don't have to go through this alone. I'm your family now, and I'll always be here to listen." As he leaned into my shoulder, something clicked in my mind. A memory from weeks ago. One of his sketches showed the same dress I had tried on, but I hadn't worn it in front of him. Jason noticed my reaction and whispered, "I saw it in the store and thought it would look nice on you. I guess I drew it because I wanted you to feel good about yourself." The unexpected twist left me speechless. This wasn't about secrets or tension. It was his way of showing care, even if it came out in ways I didn't understand. The realization brought us closer, and for the first time, the walls between us began to crumble. Jason's words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. I had been bracing myself for something darker, but this was something else entirely. He had noticed me in ways I hadn't realized, and the drawings were his way of expressing feelings he couldn't put into words. I took a deep breath, trying to process everything. "You don't have to hide things like that from me, Jason. I know this hasn't been easy for either of us, but I'm trying to figure this out too." He looked at me, hesitant, but no longer defensive. "It's not just that," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I don't belong, like I'm always in the way." His words hit me hard, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "Jason, you're not in the way. This is your home too. I don't expect us to be perfect, but I want us to be honest with each other. You can tell me anything." He nodded, but there was still a flicker of unease in his expression. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice trembling. I waited, my heart pounding, as he reached into his bag and pulled out a smaller notebook. It was different from the one I had seen before, its cover worn and the pages filled with text rather than drawings. He handed it to me, his hands shaking. As I opened it, I realized it was a journal. The entries were dated and the handwriting was messy, but one thing was clear. This notebook held his deepest thoughts. As I skimmed through the pages, my chest tightened. Jason had written about feeling invisible, about struggling to find his place in our new family, and about how much he missed his mom. But then there was an entry that caught my attention. The date was recent, and the words were raw. She doesn't even know how much I notice, how much I care. I wanted to tell her about the dress, but I couldn't. She'd think it was weird. I just want her to feel like she matters because she's trying so hard. And maybe if she knows she matters, I'll feel like I do too. Tears welled in my eyes as I closed the notebook. Jason wasn't pushing me away because he didn't care. He was scared that I didn't. Jason, I said, my voice breaking, you matter to me, more than you know. I've been so focused on trying to get this right that I didn't realize how much you've been going through. I'm so sorry. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, to my surprise, he hugged me. It was hesitant at first, but then he held on tighter, like he had been waiting for this moment all along. As we sat there, I felt the weight between us begin to lift. The conflict wasn't about misunderstandings or mistakes. It was about two people learning to see each other for who they really were. But just as I thought the moment had passed, Jason pulled away and gave me a shy smile. By the way, he said, almost teasing, that dress? You should wear it more often. It really suits you. I laughed through my tears, realizing this wasn't the ending I had expected, but it was exactly the one we both needed. The hug lingered for a moment longer before Jason finally pulled away, his cheeks slightly red. It was the first time I'd seen him smile like that in weeks, maybe months. It wasn't just a smile. It was relief, like a weight had been lifted off both of us. I guess I've been making things harder than they needed to be, I said with a small laugh, trying to lighten the mood. But I'm learning too. Jason shrugged, a little awkward but more at ease than before. We both are, I think. That evening, something shifted. We sat together at the kitchen table, not saying much, but the silence felt comfortable this time. Jason sketched in his notebook while I flipped through an old magazine. Occasionally, he'd glance up, as if to check that I was still there, and I'd meet his eyes with a reassuring smile. Later, as I was cleaning up, Jason came into the kitchen and placed the small notebook, the one filled with his thoughts, on the counter. You can keep it if you want, he said quietly. I think I'm done with it. Writing everything down helped, but now I feel, I don't know, better, I guess. I picked it up carefully, treating it like the fragile treasure it was. Are you sure? He nodded. Yeah, but maybe don't read it all at once, he added with a sheepish grin. I laughed, grateful for his newfound lightness. Deal. In the following days, things felt different. Jason started opening up more, sharing little bits about his day, or asking for advice on small things, like a school project or what to make for a snack. They were tiny steps, but they meant everything.